librarian. All right. You're live, by the way. Okay. So what we're going to do in this first session today is start teasing out more of a kind of an introductory approach to the synoptics, as distinct from what's the genre of gospel and what are the examples of gospel in earliest Christianity. So the focus today comes much more onto synoptic gospels. We're not yet getting into the synoptic problem, but we're beginning to get into the, what are these texts and why are they so important to us? And so we're going to kick off with the material we didn't get to last week. We're going to, because we talked too long on the first slide last week, like 20 minutes or something. So we're going to kick off, we'll pick up that stuff first. I mean, why 4 Gospels? And as you would have noticed, the real answer is because the world has 4 corners. So that's why we have 4 Gospels. That's convincing, I'm sure. And so if it's so important to have 4 Gospels at the end of the 2nd century, how come these days we put so much emphasis on the 3, on the synoptic 3? And it's not a Trinitarian thing, but what's going on with the 3 Gospels versus the 4 Gospels? And then let's start teasing out a little bit what is this triple tradition or the synoptic tradition. Okay? So that's kind of where we're going. So let's start with the idea that by the last quarter of the 2nd century, so between 175 and 200, the idea that there were 4 Gospels and only 4, no less, no fewer, no more, has become a key idea of normative or Catholic Christianity towards the end of the 2nd century. Now they were well aware that there were lots of other Gospels, as we were mapping out last week, and they didn't quibble over the fact that the Gospel of Judas is not a Gospel because it doesn't have this literary genre or doesn't have these characteristics. People like Irenaeus were well aware that there were other Gospels and they were reducing it to 4. That was part of the polemic that was going on at the time. It strikes me as interesting that this period, the last quarter of the 2nd century, when early Christianity is really getting its act together in terms of the definitive documentation, parallels exactly the time when the Mishnah is coming together under the leadership of Rabbi Judah Hanisi, Judah the Prince. So notionally, we say the Mishnah was published around about 200 AD or CE, but that was a project particularly driven by Rabbi Judah Hanisi, Judah the Prince, who was the kind of person recognised by the Roman occupation authority, Roman Empire, as the leader of the Jewish community in the Galilee. Okay, in the period after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And of course, those of you that have been to Beit Sherim will have seen his tomb. His grave is one of the tombs. And because of his sanctity, Beit Sherim became a traditional, highly valued burial place for other Jews who wanted to be buried close to Rabbi Judah the Prince. And the more people of that calibre who came to that cemetery, the more other people wished to be located there. It's good to have your grave in a good zip code. So, in the case of Irenaeus, we find him appealing explicitly to the idea of 4 Gospels, and we'll look briefly at a couple of his examples. This idea is also quite explicit in the fragment called the Muratorian Canon, whose date is contested, but it's commonly dated in the last quarter of the 2nd century. And it's also seen in the significance of the project by Tatian, the Diatessaron, which of course means through 4. So taking the 4 and harmonising them into a single account. But it presumes 4, not 5, not 6, not 22. It's a project that says, well, we've got the 4 Gospels, now how do we shape them down to one Gospel? Okay. So let's look briefly at this. So the first is the project of the Diatessaron, round about 175, thereabouts. And so what we've got there is a harmony of the 4 Gospels. So he didn't create one new gospel which took the place of the others, but he tried to blend all 4 gospels, including John's gospel, into a coherent, harmonious whole. Now, I guess that that firstly presumes that they are telling the same story and that they're basically compatible. So there's an assumption there about the underlying unity and harmony of the gospel voices, which we'll see some reasons to disagree with later today. But there's an assumption that the 4 apostolic voices were all on the one page. They were all talking about the same thing. Even more clearly, of course, it assumes the authority of those 4 and not other gospels. The Diatessaron did not include the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas, even though some of these documents are found in other early canonical lists and in some of the early codices. So what we have is an attempt, around about 170, 175, to take the 4 Gospels which were clearly preeminent in the esteem of the Church, and at least in that part of the Roman Empire, and to unify them into a single text. But it was a publishing project that never really took off, which is interesting. There was something about the instinct of the early Church that said, actually, no, that's a really cute project, Tatian, but we think it's important to hear the distinct voices of all 4 Gospels and not just to blend them into one whole. Now that's also interesting in really big picture stuff. If you think about some of the traditional, as in last 200 or so years, of scholarship on the Old Testament, particularly say the Pentateuch, one of the views that has shaped the debate has been that 3 or 4 substantive documents were merged into one document, and we try and pick it apart and look at different nuances. But the fundamental to a lot of Pentateuchal criticism is this idea that diverse traditions, even competing traditions about Moses and the covenant, were harmonized into a single story called the Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and then that displaces all the earlier forms of the tradition. That did not happen with the Gospels. Even though there's a known surviving attempt to create one Gospel based on the 4, it didn't cut the mustard. There's something, the other argument was found more useful or just didn't resonate, but for some reason or other, not entirely clear to us, the early Church preferred to read the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, and if push came to shove, they'd even read the Gospel of Mark, okay, rather than something that just harmonised it all together. So there's not really explicit, and yet there's something significant going on there. Then we come to the Muratorian Canon. It's a fragment of a list which is it's the earliest kind of statement of the texts that are held sacred by Christian communities. And it's a fragment in that the first part of the list is missing, but you can see from what is left of the first bit that it clearly was referring to Matthew and Mark prior to Luke and John, because it starts in mid-sentence about a gospel earlier than Luke, and then it talks about the third book of the gospel is that according to Luke. So it's pretty clear we're dealing with somebody who has a list of 4 gospels, of which Luke is the third and John is the fourth. Okay. Now I guess we can't prove that Matthew and Mark were the missing terms, but there are no other candidates for this kind of a list. So it's pretty clear that whoever is responsible for this fragment, and whether it's 175 or 200 or 250, somewhere around that window, there was this idea of 4 Gospels, and they were also aware of nuances between those 4 Gospels. It's not just a list, it's an annotated list commenting on some of the differences. And part of the tradition is that they're distinguishing between those Gospels which are apostolic, eyewitnesses, and those Gospels which are written by associates of the apostles. So that's an interesting distinction for the church to be making, in the last quarter of the 2nd century. And it doesn't really tell us whether or not those books were written by apostles or associates of apostles. What it tells us unambiguously is that that issue mattered to the Christian leadership at the end of the 2nd century. They wanted to claim that unlike the Gnostics, unlike their opponents, they were the custodians of a tradition that went back to the apostles and the immediate associates of the apostles. So it tells us what mattered to the 2nd century leaders at the end of the 2nd century. It doesn't actually provide evidence about what was the state of affairs in the 1st century, but it takes us into the psychology and the value system of the late 2nd century. Got that difference? So that's the Muratorian Canon. And then we get Irenaeus. Interesting guy. I did a lot of work on Irenaeus as part of my doctorate on the Antichrist, because he's one of the first people to write extensively about the Antichrist tradition. And he's written a 5-volume book against the heretics, versus heresis. So in book 3, chapter 11, verse 8, we get the section where he's talking about the Gospels. And don't try this argument in your essay, okay? Do not use this kind of argument in academic work today. But in the context of his time, just as Paul will use arguments in Galatians and so on that are not actually persuasive to us, but they were persuasive within the rhetorical conventions and the argument. And we can all have arguments where we win the argument for reasons that are wrong, but we still won the argument. The other person gave in and came around to our point of view. That we think later, got away with that one. Or, he should have challenged that. I really didn't know what I was talking about. So it's that kind of thing. So here we have a good example of that. It's not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. It's just inconceivable. They have to be 4. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered through all the world, the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel. Now, actually, I find that a more interesting, significant statement than the number statement. The Gospels are seen as foundational to the life of the church, which is interesting. And therefore, there had to be 4 of them, because that's how the world is structured. And we'll go on to see some other examples of that. But it's fitting that the church itself must rest on 4 pillars, because the world itself is constructed as 4 zones and 4 principal winds. And then he goes on as well to actually describe very briefly, and to fit it on the screen without being microprint, I've just captured the bits that name the Gospels and then put in the ellipsis. But for that, according to John, and interesting, he starts with the one he loves most, one he finds most meaningful, presumably. For that, according to John, relates his original, effectual and glorious generation from the Father, But that, according to Luke, taking up his priestly character, because there's a lot more temple stuff at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, and even at the end and going into Acts, there's more focus on the temple. Matthew again relates his generation as a man. Mark, on the other hand, commences with a reference to the prophetical spirit coming down from on high to men. So we're actually not only getting the 4 Gospels, we're getting them listed by their theological priority for Irenaeus, and a brief, well, it's more than a 1-line summary because I've just abstracted it, but a brief discussion of the key theological ideas of each Gospel. So, by the way, this fellow Irenaeus, he was actually from what we would now call Turkey, and he was a student of the elder John, not the Apostle John, but John the elder, John the Presbyter, who's a famous early Christian leader in Asia Minor in the early part of the 2nd century. And so he describes it at one stage. He sat at the feet of John, who sat at the feet of the apostles. Yeah, that's the living tradition that Irenaeus is writing out of, and that's a very different space than any of us will ever be in. Okay, I can tell you that my Dr. Varta was a student of Caseman, who was a student of Bultmann, but we don't play those sort of games in quite the same way these days. Okay, and that's not quite the same thing as Jesus, apostles, John, Irenaeus, but you get that idea of pedigree, personal pedigree. So, but then there was a major outbreak of persecution in France, what we would now call France, Gaul, particularly at Lyon. The bishop was killed by the Roman authorities, so Irenaeus was sent to be the new bishop of Lyon immediately after that amazing persecution where a lot of his flock had been killed. So he's a pastoral leader in a time of real conflict, where people were being killed for being Christian, and he gets sent from today, we'd say from Turkey to France, to be the Bishop of Lyon. While he's there, he writes a commentary on the Book of Daniel, and he writes the Adversus Erasus and so on. So an interesting, argumentative character from the late 2nd century. And so, in talking about the reason for the 4 Gospels, he talks about the living creatures in Ezekiel, and the sort of vision that Ezekiel describes in the opening chapter of that book. The 4 living creatures are quadriform, and the gospel is quadriform. Okay? As also is the course followed by the Lord. For this reason were the 4 principal covenants given to the human race. So he's spinning a theological argument around the notion of fourness. Prior to the deluge under Adam, after the deluge under Noah, the 3rd covenant with Moses, and the 4th covenant, the gospel. Okay, so he's dividing history up into 4 periods. In another part of his work, he'll divide the history up into 7,000 years. Okay, 6,000 years up to the time of the Parousia, and then the 1,000 years of the millennium. So he plays with these sort of numerical games. And the other one to consider in this category, although he's not exactly naming the books, is of course the preface to Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. And we often skip over this and don't pay a lot of attention, but I think it's a really interesting paragraph for us to pay attention to. It's one of the few times, if not the only time, that any of the gospel writers speak in their own voice and say, hello, this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. Okay? So I've just broken it up into paragraphs so we can see the ideas a little bit more clearly, but it starts out with a recognition that many people prior to Luke's writing, many others have tried their hand at the task of writing a gospel. Okay? Now, for that reason alone, an early date for Luke's gospel presumably is unsustainable. For Luke to be able to say, I'm not only am I not the first, there have been many other attempts to do the kind of project I'm about to do. That pushes this paragraph well into the 2nd century, I suggest. Okay? Which has theological implications, but I think that's just the reality. So there have been lots of other people who've tried to set out an orderly account of the events. And then he describes the events as being handed on, a process of transmission and reception by people who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Logos, servants of the Word. Okay? So, and we don't know exactly what he's referring to, but the suggestion is there were within the community of the early Christians, there were people with a particular role in preserving and handing on the traditions. They could simply be the teachers, the people identified as teachers. And among them would be some of the early apostles, particularly someone like Paul. Right? But he's recognising that there were people who actually had a ministry of being custodians of the tradition, passing it on. So and that's not the focus of what he's describing, so it's just like a passing comment, but for that reason all the more interesting as historical evidence. So given that others have already had a crack at this, and they've tried to work with the material that's been handed down to us from those that went before, I decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very beginning, to write an orderly account for you as well, most excellent Theophilus. Okay. So Luke is saying, I'm going to try and I've researched this, I've done my reading, I've done my research, and I'm going to pull it all together into a coherent whole. Okay. That, of course, does not mean that Luke is giving us the historically accurate version and the others are lacking in some aspect. But it does suggest that Luke thought that he was writing the definitive account, which presumably he expected to displace the other versions, not to be read in parallel to the other versions. Okay. Yeah.
What was Luke's relationship with Theophilus? Was Theophilus like a patron?
We would love to know what the relationship was, and we'd love to know who Theophilus was, and we'd love to know what Luke's relationship with Theophilus was. We don't know. Theophilus is just a word that means lover of God. It's a name, proper name, but its actual meaning is lover of God. So is it a real person, which it could be, or is it a dear inquirer, like the old Frank and Ernest kind of skits from 20, 30 years ago? Hello, Frank. Oh, hello, Ernest. And so you have this Frank and Ernest kind of conversation, but it's playing off the joke of being frank and being earnest. Now, so we don't know whether he's an archetypal learned reader. I'm addressing this study to those who are lovers of God. Or is he a particular individual with status who for some reason Luke is trying to influence? Or is he in fact the person who's funded Luke's sabbatical to write this book? We don't know. So we can all imagine whatever we want. But again, it comes into place to our imagination of who is Luke, what's he doing, what social niche is he coming out of with this project. And I find it helpful to parallel Luke with his Theophilus possible patron, with Josephus, who's writing a multi-volume history of the Jewish people for his patron Vespasian. Okay. And of course Titus ultimately. So what's are there now? He's not in the same league as Josephus on an imperial pension in Rome, but Luke is the expression of early Christianity which is most deeply embedded into the Roman social structure, whereas Mark is not, and even Paul is not embedded in the system in the same way, even though Paul's a Roman citizen with certain privileges. So we don't know. We'd love to know. So he's writing an orderly account. Orderly account does not mean accurate, true, reliable. Just means orderly. I have some idea in my brain, and I'm ordering the information according to my pattern, like any good essay writer will do. Okay. This verse has often been taken to say Luke is the most consciously, intentionally historical of all the Gospels. He's not saying that. He might like us to think that. He's actually saying, I'm ordering the information for you in a well-structured way. And it could be theological, it could be literary, it could be historical, it could be a mix of all those things that mattered to Luke, and which he's just hinting at in this opening paragraph. And why is he doing this? He's doing this, Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed, which suggests that Theophilus is not a pagan official, but actually somebody already within the life of the church, although possibly a person of high status, or possibly simply a member of the church who is well embedded in the Greco-Roman culture, and not simply a peasant or a leather worker or a ship owner or something. Okay? Now the reason for mentioning that in this case is just to put it alongside the stuff from Tatian and the Muratorian Canon and Irenaeus and say, there's an awareness from early in the 2nd century to late in the 2nd century that there are many Gospels out there. Luke is not yet claiming, this one is going to be one of the big 4 when the final cut is made, okay? But Luke is one of the 4 that makes it into the final cut. And this is the opening paragraph of Luke, which already shows an awareness that there are other Gospels. But at this stage, none of the other Gospels have the kind of status that Luke feels a need to defer to and say, I really couldn't do a better job than John. Who am I to differ with Matthew? Well, actually, Luke's going to differ with Matthew extensively as we go through. Okay? So he's in a very different space from Tatian, who says, I'm not going to write a new gospel, I'm going to take the 4 that everybody acknowledges and weave them into one. Okay? Luke is not doing that project. Luke is at an earlier stage of the project, but he may be only 1 generation earlier than Tatian. And if that's the case, it solidifies very quickly. Okay? And if that is what happened, it'll be because of the exigencies of the conflict with Marcion and the conflict with the Gnostics. That under the pressure of that internal church conflict, the Christians had to get their act together, just as in parallel the Jewish community had to get their act together after the yet another disastrous conflict with Rome and a failure of the Messiah to appear, etc., etc. Okay? So certainly by the end of the 2nd century, there's no question there are 4 Gospels that matter. The rest are heretical from the perspective of the bishops. Beginning of the 2nd century, there are lots of Gospels around, but none of them yet has any preeminence. So something has happened between 100 and 180. Significant change has happened in terms of the books that Christians are recognising. Okay? So let's focus then on the triple tradition and look at the Synoptics in a bit more detail. Okay. So imagine for a moment we had a Bible that did not include the Synoptic Gospels. Well, it would be thinner for a start, okay, a bit lighter, not so much to memorise. But imagine a book. It would have the letters of Paul, would have the Gospel of John, it'd have the other letters, which are basically Peter, James and John, if you stop and think about them. And it would have the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse. But it wouldn't have Matthew, Mark and Luke. So what would be missing from what we recognise as Christian tradition? What would be missing if our story of Jesus, if the only gospel we had was the Gospel of John, what would we be missing from our picture of Jesus and our picture of what it means to be a Christian?
The teachings of Jesus.
You wouldn't have the parables and the aphorisms. You'd have these long discourses in John, but you wouldn't have any of the parables. Yep.
And no Sermon on the Mount.
No Sermon on the Mount, no Lord's Prayer. Get that from the Didache, of course, but we wouldn't use it because it's just in the Didache. There'd be no Christmas, no infancy plays at your local preschool centre. May not be a bad thing, but no Jesus, Mary and the wee donkey heading off to Egypt, any of that stuff. Okay. Temptation narratives, some of the interplay between Jesus and John the Baptist would be a little bit differently nuanced because of the lack of or the reliance on John's Gospel. Yeah, we'll come back to the cast of characters, but there'd be a different set of characters that we'd be thinking of as being around Jesus, and the nature of his interaction with his contemporaries would be different.
The ascension.
No ascension, of course, because that's really only in Luke anyway, but certainly not in Mark and Matthew. It's not really an ascension, although we tend to read Matthew 28, 18 to 20, through the lens of the bigger story from Luke Acts. But there is no ascension in Matthew's Gospel. The disciples go to the mountain and Jesus, appears out of the thin air. And then actually there is no closure to that scene. The book just finishes, but I guess we all imagine he sort of went by and disappeared back into thin air. Okay, but Matthew doesn't tell us that. It's left to our imagination. Okay.
No genealogy.
No genealogies, because John's not interested in that stuff. Yep.
The Lazarus story would be really big, like,
Yeah.
proportionally without the other Gospels to balance
Yeah.
that.
The question of miracles and so on will be nuanced differently as well.
Different healing stories.
Yeah. Okay. For instance, we'll see in a moment, John has no exorcisms. Like John's Jesus doesn't do evil spirits. Thank you very much. Okay. Whereas they're quite common in the Synoptics, relatively speaking. Okay. Also, Jesus' attitude or the dynamics between Jesus and his family and Jesus and his hometown would be very different. Okay. You know, the mother of the Lord plays a role in John's Gospel that she simply does not have in the Synoptic tradition. But equally, in the Synoptic tradition, the people of Nazareth say, hey, we know this guy. He's the carpenter's son. He's Mary's kid. I mean, you know, who do you think he is? You don't get that in John's Gospel. In fact, in John's Gospel, they say, we know who this guy is. We know his father and his mother. He's the son of Joseph. And today is the feast of Joseph, the husband of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So John has a very explicit tradition that Joseph is the biological father of Jesus, even though it has a high Christology of Jesus as the incarnate Logos. Okay, so you don't, and there's absolutely no virgin birth in John's Gospel, even though you have the Logos Christology. So very different way of dealing with Jesus if we only had John's Gospel and we weren't factoring in the Synoptics. Okay. Now, of course, we do have the Synoptics, but we don't always appreciate just how much they have enriched our understanding of Jesus and our understanding of faith, you know, because we tend to, as church, we primarily function in John and Paul land. Okay, and the Synoptics are honoured and respected, and we read them in church for the 3-year cycle, but we really live in the letters of Paul and the Gospel of John. That's where Christianity operates out of. And the Synoptic Gospels are sort of the overlooked voice in some ways. Okay? And we'll come back to that in a second. So, 3 Gospels, not 4. What is going on here? We've seen the ancient emphasis on 4 Gospels, and we've already alluded to the fact that in the modern church, there's very much a focus on the 3 Synoptic Gospels. And this is very much a modern phenomenon. Okay? If you go back to the Book of Common Prayer of 1662 and the Collect Epistle and Gospels in the Book of Common Prayer, it's primarily Matthew and John. And it's a 1-year cycle, so you only had to write 52 sermons and then use them year after year after year. Okay? It's okay because nobody listened anyway, so yeah, it was fine. So particularly since the emergence of critical New Testament scholarship in the aftermath of the Enlightenment, and particularly with the liturgical renewal movement, you know, from the beginning of the 20th century, there's been this shift away from a 1-year lectionary to a 3-year lectionary. And the 3-year lectionary means, of course, that we give primacy to the Synoptics, and John gets relegated to the margins. Okay? And we pay attention to John
Is
in
that
the...
because the world has 3 corners?
No, it's the world has 3 stories, you know? Underworld, our world, and upstairs. Yeah. No, but I think it's this. Some of us sometimes complain that the church doesn't really embrace, critical scholarship. But actually, the 3-year lectionary is an example of the church, indeed the Catholic Church, taking on board the emphasis on the Synoptics and structuring the Sunday lectionary readings around the 3 Synoptic Gospels, even though you've really got to push it a bit to have Year B based on Mark, because a whole lot of the story is not in Mark's Gospel. So we supplement it with John, of course, in a few places as well. And we primarily focus on John during Lent and Easter. That's when John gets a Guernsey.
Greg, does that mean that we don't ever read in Easter week, like for Good Friday and Easter Sunday, we don't get John?
Oh, we do. Yeah, I'm talking about the regular Sunday lectionary, not the festivals, not the holy festivals.
Oh, okay. So it does vary.
The Sunday lectionary is basically Matthew year A, Mark with a bit of supplements for year 2, Luke for year C. But then when you get things like, say, the Good Friday's liturgy, the Good Friday liturgy, the Passion is always John's Gospel. Whereas Palm Sunday, it rotates between Matthew, Mark and Luke. Only in the last 50, 60 years with the liturgical renewal movement, which was driven by Rome after Vatican II with the Common Lectionary, which then was adopted by the other liturgical churches. And then the Revised Common Lectionary is a further iteration of that. So there's been actually a significant embrace of a different way of thinking about the Gospels, which recognises the significance of the synoptic voice alongside John. But we don't have a 4-year cycle. We don't have a year of John. Okay, we focus on Matthew, Mark and Luke. And now, how much of that was thought out and how much of it was just somebody who was shaped by emerging New Testament scholarship and said, well, we're going to have a 3-year cycle. Let's focus on the 3 synoptic Gospels. We'll fit John in a bit here and there kind of thing. But it's interesting that whereas in the up until, and I'm only describing the West. I'm describing basically the Western churches. I'm not talking about the Greek Orthodox or others who don't change that sort of stuff. But in the Roman Church and in the major Western denominations, there's been this very significant corporate decision to pay attention to the synoptic Gospels in a way that Christians have never ever done in the last 2,000 years. Because previously we focused on Matthew and John, and Luke for things like Ascension and so on. Matthew was the church's Gospel. That's where the Lord's Prayer came out. That's where the Sermon on the Mount is. That's where the word church occurs only 2 times in the Gospels and so on. So Matthew had a dominance because it had the sayings and the birth stories and the resurrection and so on. And John had the high Christology and the great I am sayings and all that sort of stuff. So something has happened, and for many of us, probably all of us, we're actually young enough not to notice that change, because that's the water we've been swimming in for the last 50 years in terms of church life. Okay? Whereas as recently as the 1960s, 1970s, that was a whole new idea. Nobody would have even suggested that. Okay. So what's going on? Why this priority to the synoptics, and why this relatively downplay or avoidance of John? Now the next 4 slides just basically pick up some of the top level differences between the synoptics and John. Now they're not these are not all of equal weight, okay, and they're not like earth-shattering insights, but it's just a way of mapping some of the nuances of things that are representative, distinctive, characteristic of the synoptic tradition, things that are more characteristic and representative of the Johannine tradition. So the synoptic Gospels, most of what Jesus does is in the Galilee, and then he makes a trip to Jerusalem and gets killed. In John, a lot of what is going on is centred in and around Jerusalem. Okay? The people the issues that the synoptics are dealing with are Jesus is in dialogue, in argument, controversy with the scribes, the Pharisees, and issues around Shabbat observance. Okay? In John, the activity of Jesus is structured around the Jewish festivals, okay, the Passover, Festival of Weeks, and Festival of Booths and so on, and the people that Jesus is in conflict with are simply the Jews, as if Jesus and the disciples are not Jews. So it's Jesus against the Jews, whereas previously it was Jesus the Jew in argument like a good Jew with the scribes and the Pharisees about Shabbat and other issues. Okay? So there's a shift going on here. In the Synoptic Gospels, there's only one reference to Passover, and it's the one that Jesus observes in Jerusalem and dies in that context. In John's Gospel, there are 3 different references to Passover, which don't need to be 3 different Passovers, but traditionally have been understood as, Jesus' ministry encompassing at least 3 different Passover observances, which means a ministry of at least 2 years. Whereas in Mark, everything could happen in 6 to 9 months. There's not a lot of action there, really. Okay? Well, that's that point, all right? Okay, so Mark, everything could happen in a year or so. John's Gospel needs, minimum 2, not more than 3 years to complete. That doesn't mean that 3 references to Passover proves that Jesus' ministry extended over 3 different Passovers. It's just that that's the detail that's in the story, as distinct from the world behind the text. The Synoptics, at least Matthew and Luke, have the infancy traditions. John has the Logos hymn and no Christmas story. Okay. In the Synoptics, we find the story, the actual description of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, whereas in John's Gospel, John the Baptist says, when I baptized this guy, I saw the Spirit descending on him. But there is no story of the baptism in John's Gospel. It's alluded to, but it's an event off stage. It's not actually described. Okay? The Jesus kind of wrestling with what is God wanting me to do in the Synoptics, that's dealt with in the temptation narrative. In John's Gospel, it's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, not mine. So that's where Jesus is tempted in John's Gospel. Okay, not in the temptation stories. In the Synoptics, Jesus is the teacher and prophet. In John, he's the Son who comes down from heaven to reveal the truth of God. The Son of Man versus the Son of God. In the Synoptics, Jesus' characteristic speech are aphorisms and parables. That's his voice print. In John, he gives long, rambling discourses, which do not meet the criteria for academic coherence for an essay. Okay? Circles around, covers the same thing, changes his point of view, and so on, in these rambling discourses. In the Synoptics, one of the areas of activity for Jesus is he's in a conflict with the evil spirits, and exorcism is a frequent event. There is not a single exorcism in John's Gospel. The Synoptics are full of healings and miraculous events, and the Greek word that's used there is dunamis, miracle, mighty deed, the word from which we get dynamite. Okay? Kapow. In John's Gospel there are healings and miracles, but the word that's used is semeion, sign. So Jesus' activity is understood as Jesus the miracle man or Jesus the sign worker. And they're actually different worlds. They're different ways of conceptualizing what Jesus is doing. Okay? These, as some of you know, because you've got them printed off, these are all on the website as well as a PDF, which you can grab. Might even have it there, I'm not sure. Continuing on, in the Synoptics, Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, the basileia tou theou. In John's Gospel, there's very little talk of the kingdom of God, but there's characteristically a predominance of talk about eternal life and having true knowledge and and being set free by that knowledge. In the Synoptics, the focus is on the message of Jesus. In John, the focus is on the person of Jesus. It's, those who believe in the Son, those who accept the one who the Father has sent, will be saved. When in the Synoptics, it's listen to me. I'm telling you about God's kingdom. You need to turn around. In the Synoptics, Jesus is particularly focused on the poor and the powerless, the marginalised, and so on. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is talking in categories about rescuing people who are lost in darkness, trapped in sin. Different nuance of the target audience. The moment of glorification for Jesus is the transfiguration story in the Synoptics, whereas for John's Gospel, the moment of glorification is when I am lifted up on the cross, I will draw all people to myself. So the crucifixion is the high point of Jesus' revelation for John, whereas in the Synoptics, it's the transfiguration is when we actually see who Jesus is. The Last Supper narrative occurs in the Synoptic Gospels, and I'm thinking particularly, actually not so much Last Supper as the Lord's Supper and the Eucharistic institution is in Synoptics, whereas in John's Gospel we have a long discourse in chapter 6 about the bread that comes down from heaven. You need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. But there's simply nothing in the John 13 about Jesus doing anything with bread and wine and telling people to keep doing it. Okay? There's still a Last Supper, but it's a totally different focus on the Last Supper. So that really should read Lord's Supper rather than Last Supper. So the focus in the Last Supper narrative in John is the foot washing and the instruction about discipleship and serving one another, and there's nothing equivalent to that in the Synoptics. The nearest equivalent would be Mark chapter 10 and parallel passages where Jesus talks about, the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve, give his life as a ransom for many, and that I'm among you as one who serves, you should also serve each other. But it's not tied to the foot washing, it's tied to the request from the mother of the sons of Zebedee for her two boys to get the plum jobs when the kingdom comes. Okay, so a similar dynamic, but it's dealt with in a totally different way in the Synoptics. And of course part of what's going on here is that the three Synoptics deal with it in a similar way to each other, whereas John deals with it in a totally different way. Final set of comparisons. In the Synoptics, Jesus gives teaching towards the end of the story, just before his arrest. Jesus gives the apocalyptic or eschatological discourse, talking about the end of the world, the great judgment, At a similar place in the story, after they've left the upper room, they've gone to the Garden of Gethsemane. John's Gospel has Jesus talking about discipleship and I will send the Paraclete, I will send another one, and it's a totally different script at that point. The prayer in Gethsemane in the Synoptic Gospels is Jesus agonizing over things, whereas in the similar prayer in Gethsemane in John chapter 17, and this partly contradicts what I said earlier actually, Jesus is not agonizing over faithfulness and God's call on his life. He's calmly discussing how to set up the church with God and praying for these that they may be one as you and I are one. It's a totally different space that the Jesus character is in the Gethsemane prayer in John chapter 18, as distinct for the Jesus sweating drops of blood and agonizing over whether or not to go this route, which we find in Matthew, Mark and Luke. Okay. In the Synoptics, Jesus refuses to say anything during his trial. In John's Gospel, he has a very interesting discourse with Pilate about what is truth and what kind of a king am I and all that sort of stuff. Again, a different script, a different play, different piece of drama. And then we come to the question of characters. In the Synoptic Gospels, there are other characters, but the overwhelming focus is on Peter, James and John, who just happen to be the three pillars of the church mentioned by Paul in Galatians, and they just happen to be the people with whom the non-Pauline epistles are also directly associated. The letter of James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. That are what's going on here. Okay? These guys have cachet in certain circles in the early church. Whereas in John's Gospel, we hear about Andrew and Philip and Nathaniel and Nicodemus and Lazarus, Joseph of Arimathea, Thomas the twin, Mary Magdalene gets a bigger role, and of course we have the mother of the Lord. So a much more diverse set of characters that are central to the story and have major roles. Okay?
And is there much scholarship on what's going on there, particularly when you're making reference to the letters as well? Have we got this is because this is the Johannine community who has less, is not engaging with those other documents, or believes that they're, like, the cast of characters seems very significant.
Yep, and you've done Gospel of John last year, so yeah. Yes, there is scholarship around it. Part of the issue is, again, to what extent, we just take the text as they are, and that's, I think, the most important orientation. Take the text as they are, and that includes recognising what they have in common with each other and where they have characteristic differences from each other, because that's part of the reality of text as we have them. But part of what we're about to do in a moment, part of reading these texts is that we find it hard not to ask questions about the dynamics behind the text. What's going on in the Johannine community, as distinct from the Matthean community. How similar, how different. If a member of the Matthean community from Antioch in Syria, if they were relocated in their employment and found themselves in Ephesus and started to go to the Johannine, the Church of St. John the Evangelist in Ephesus, would it just be an equal transfer, or would they have to kind of establish their credentials? And now, by the end of the 2nd century, that's not an issue, because the bishop's in charge, and there's a canon of texts and the 4 Gospels and so on. But yeah, the question, the extent to which we can interrogate or look through the text to notice something about the community that gave us the text. Yeah, it's an interesting question, but it's really a hard one to answer definitively. But it has been one of the focal points of New Testament scholarship in the last few decades. And an earlier attempt to do a lot of that stuff was some of the work by Raymond Brown, who particularly focused on the community of the Johannine Church versus the other groups. He wrote a little paper about that size called "The Churches the Apostles Left Behind," and it's a classic sort of redaction history study where you look at the Markan community and the Matthean community, the Lucan community, the Johannine community, the Pauline community. That's a nice book, good publishing project. Be picked up by a good publisher for sure. Okay, does that sound cynical? Okay.
Slightly. Just slightly.
Just slightly. Okay. All right. So, looking then at the Synoptic tradition, so we've sort of just mapped, the broad patterns of distinctive differences between the Synoptic tradition and John. But if we come back and look at the data from another angle, we're looking at, so what do these traditions have in common? The threefold tradition that we find in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And hopefully that's big enough that you can sort of make sense of it. I don't know that I can make it any bigger. No. So there's a reasonably common pattern to the Synoptic tradition, and I'll just read it out loud for the case it's a bit small. So there's an opening scene with a bit of background information, which in the case of Matthew is 4 chapters, in Mark it's half a chapter, and in Luke it's 3.5 chapters. So that's where we will find, for instance, the infancy traditions in the case of Matthew and Luke, genealogies, things like that. Then we have a section where the synoptics all begin with Jesus doing stuff in the Galilee. And that's not accidental. The Galilee was not the centre of Jewish life during the Herodian period. So it's significant, interesting that the tradition remembers Jesus as being a Galilean, not as a Jerusalem person. Okay? Now, for instance, and that may not be something that the significant hits us, but when we look at some of the things like the infancy gospel of James and the infancy gospel of Thomas, where the tradition is more removed from a real connection with the historical past, they have no idea of geography of Palestine, and so they have sort of Nazareth, or they have the events of the infancy story happening around Jerusalem, because for them the sacred location is Jerusalem, so events get relocated. Indeed, even Luke's gospel relocates Easter, so it entirely happens in Jerusalem. There are no Galilean appearances in the Gospel of Luke. So Easter gets rescheduled in Luke's Gospel. Luke 1, verses 1 to 4, I'm telling you the story my way. I'm ordering the account. Okay? Orderly account. It does not mean chronological. It can mean chronological, but it's not only chronological. So Luke does not want Jesus and the disciples to go back up to the Galilee. He wants them to head towards Rome. Okay? So there is no go back to Galilee, that's where he told you he'll meet them. Delete that from the text. It's in Matthew and Mark. Delete it. Luke doesn't want that theme. Okay? So there's a freedom to edit the tradition, even in Luke's Gospel. But they all begin with this memory that Jesus is a Galilean. And a Galilean Jew was slightly different to a Jerusalem Jew. Now, we can now nuance that differently because we have much finer data on what Galilean Jews were like in the first couple of decades of the first century. Come to Bethsaida, you'll hear about it. So it used to be the case that we would talk about the difference between Jerusalem Jews and Galilean Jews, and the Galilean Jews were anti-Jerusalem. That's almost certainly wrong. The Jews living in the Galilee were probably Judean settlers who were populating the Galilee to raise the Jewish presence in the Galilee. Think Russians in Crimea, Serbs, but it's deliberate ethnic, colonization. So the Jewish population, the Galilee, was seen as Hicks by the Jerusalem people, but were intensely loyal to Jerusalem because it was core to their identity that they were Jews. They weren't anti-temple. They were just the country cousins and people that didn't go to the right synagogues and have the right theological skills. Okay, so there's a different nuancing these days. But it's interesting that Matthew, Mark and Luke all preserve a very strong tradition of Jesus in Galilee, and yet Galilee totally disappears from Christian literature after the Synoptic Gospels. Okay? We never hear of a Christian community in the Galilee, not even in the book of Acts, because Luke writes it out of the story. He's focused on Rome, because the big game is Rome, not Galilee. Okay? So Jesus' home patch is ignored after he heads south to Jerusalem. But the story, despite that, the story begins with remembering Jesus as a Galilean from an otherwise totally never heard of town called Nazareth. Okay. Then, not in Mark, but in Matthew and Luke, we get the Great Sermon, which in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. Luke deals with it in a slightly different way. Then you get Jesus and his disciples involved in some sort of mission activity, which for Matthew is chapters 9 to 12, Mark is chapter 3, and Luke it's chapter 7. Then we get a collection of parables. So it's in all three Gospels have this basic structure. Collection of parables. Then we get stories and episodes around the question of, so who is this guy? And there's controversy and conflict around the identity and the significance and the status of Jesus. Then they all have Jesus making a journey to Jerusalem. Famously in Luke, Luke chapter 9, 51, 52, and he turned his face to go to Jerusalem. And in Luke's Gospel, he never goes back to the Galilee, and not even after Easter. But notice Luke, Mark has one chapter, Matthew has 2 chapters, Luke has 10 chapters on the road to Jerusalem. Same basic structure, but he's really loaded that part of the story with almost half his gospel is Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. It's interesting what's going on here. So this is not just historical. I mean, there's no doubt Jesus travelled from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's not a historical question. How he did it and who he went with and what route he took, who knows. But Luke has turned that basic, simple, historical datum into a major literary achievement. Okay? Almost, close to 10 chapters on the journey, well, probably is 10 chapters on the journey to Jerusalem. Okay. Then, of course, we have Jesus in Jerusalem. Well, yes, of course, but okay, so this is going to be, the emerging conflict between Jesus and the temple authorities. The last days of Jesus, basically the arrest, trial, crucifixion, which are points where the synoptic tradition is very close, although again, Luke in particular has a couple of nuances that are different from the others. And then the resurrection tradition, the final chapter in each of the three Gospels, but handled very differently, as I've said. In Mark, we simply have an empty tomb. That's it. In Matthew, we have the empty tomb, and then we have the appearance of the risen Christ in the Galilee on the mountain, and the Great Commission. And in Luke 24, we have the Emmaus Road story, and then we have the appearances and so on, but there is no going back to Galilee. So, same segment of the essay, the conclusion, but the conclusion is being handled very differently in each of the three Gospels. And very differently from John, who of course has the appearances of Jesus in the upper room, then a week later when Thomas is there, and then in chapter 21 we have Jesus and the disciples by the sea, Jesus cooking them fish as they come in and so on. So it's an entirely different set of Easter traditions in John's Gospel. Now in my view, Luke knew John's Gospel and chose not to tell the story that way. I think he was doing it I think John is one of the many others that Luke is referring to in Luke chapter 1. But that's a minority view. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? We've got texts of significance. The Synoptic Gospels are our earliest extant, complete Gospels. Okay. Yes, there may have been Gospels, and we have some fragments of Gospel material earlier, but even if Q existed, we don't have Q. And we're still looking for it. One of the people who digs the Bethsaida is John Kloppenborg, who's probably the preeminent world scholar on Q. And so one of the standard jokes is that he wants to find a critical first edition of Q, because some people think it came from not Bethsaida diggers, but some scholars associate Q with a place like Bethsaida, the Galilean Jesus community. So a couple of years ago, we actually had one of those little magnetic alphabet thing you play with your kids when they're learning to write, and we had a Q letter. So we made sure it went into John's bucket as he was digging, and he still didn't see it, and he took it to the sifter, and he's sifting his bucket, and he noticed there was something there, he reached across and threw it out. Because we're all standing around watching. He said, "John, you just threw out Q." Anyway, so we have a bit of fun with him. So the Synoptics are our earliest complete extant Gospels. And that makes them incredibly significant. Because we have the three Synoptics, the triple tradition, we've got this set of overlapping ancient documents which to some extent we're aware of each other, clearly are sharing some of the same information, but are choosing to give it their own spin. Okay? So they're not three totally independent witnesses, but they're three witnesses that have an independence about them. And that makes them, from historical terms, that's brilliant. And we have nothing like that for Julius Caesar. And this goes to the question of the essay on this role of the Synoptic Gospels as sources. We have nothing of that equivalent to the Synoptic Gospels for some of the best known, inverted commas, characters in ancient history. So they're significant not just because they do provide some historical information, and that's true, but that's not their primary significance. The Synoptics are significant in terms of what Christians believe. They're significant in terms of Christian behaviour, ethics, morals, virtue, and of course they're significant liturgically, and increasingly so, given the threefold, the 3-year lectionary and so And these are the creative works that in many ways defined Christianity. Okay? Paul's letters wouldn't do it. Paul's letters tell us some things to do and not to do and how to structure some aspects of our life together. But they don't create Christianity in the way that the Synoptic Gospels do, in terms of defining what it is, who we're centred around and so on. And they have, as we'll see later on, they have a dynamic, dialogical kind of relationship with each other and also with us. Because they shape what we think about Jesus, but then as we read them and ask questions of the text, we also find ourselves asking questions about ourselves and challenging what we thought about Jesus and so on. So these are really significant texts. And in a sense, a little bit what Sue was hinting at before, or getting at before, the Synoptics, along with John, to some extent, invite us to discern some trajectories within early Christianity. The trouble is we can't document all the points in the trajectory, but they do remind us that early Christianity was not a golden age where everybody believed the same stuff and behaved in the same ways. And now, I happened to grow up and my initial Christian formation was in a different tradition where the big idea for the Churches of Christ was if we go back to the New Testament, to simple, primitive Christianity, we'll get away from all these man-made divisions. Well, guess what, honey? The New Testament is full of man-made divisions. It's not but that was a view of Scripture which looked at through, rose-tinted glasses, imagined that Scripture spoke with one voice. If we could just all get back to the Bible, everything would be sorted out. Well, it doesn't work that way. Okay? If we read the Bible closely, and if we don't just read the Bible through our existing confessional lens, we will notice considerable diversity. And so the fact that there are 3, indeed 4 canonical Gospels invites us to notice this dynamic, contested relationship as being, I would say, of the essence of being a Christian. That we don't have the answers, but we have an invitation to engage in the wrestling match and in an active discipleship. End of sermon. All right, let's then look briefly at one of the set readings for this week, which was the book chapter by Scott McKnight. So what's Scott McKnight has provided, I think, is a really thoughtful, insightful essay. I found myself disagreeing or standing back from some of his assumptions. I suspect for some of you it was pretty heavy reading as well. And it's stuff that we will circle back through at different stages. So by the end of the semester, that kind of stuff will be a more familiar conversation. Eventually I thought, who is this guy? Why do I know his name? Where do I know him from? Anyway, so I did a Googling, of course, and he's a high-profile evangelical author in the US, a very active blogger. Wrote a bestseller of 2004, I think it was, called The Jesus Creed, and has hosted a major internet blog conversation at BeliefNet, and then more recently on another site that I have lost memory of at the moment. So that helps me to locate him as coming out of a particular sector within the ecclesial and academic conversation. He teaches at a Baptist theological college in the north, so not Southern Baptist, but American Baptist, which are more open and broad-minded. But he actually identifies himself as being Anabaptist. So he identifies with the more sort of radical Reformation tradition. And that's fine. I mean, it's good to put up front where you're coming from and what sources within the historical life of the church you resonate with. And this is where Scott McKnight is coming from. So we all have perspectives, and it's not easy at times to avoid polemics. And there are 1 or 2 places where I thought, you're being a bit polemical there, particularly at one point he's pretending to describe the Jesus seminar, but not. And as someone in the seminar, I was able to think, he really has missed the point, and we're just trying to score points at this stage. So what I realised as I read into his work and did a bit of background checking on where he's coming from, that in some ways Scott McKnight and I would come from very different corners of the theological conversation. Okay? That makes it all the more interesting that in so many of the stuff he's talking about, he and I would be in very close agreement. We come from we have different methodologies, different set of assumptions, probably place a very different emphasis on the historicity or reliability of the biblical text, but in many ways our pastoral theological reading of the text gets us to the same place. Okay? So don't burn me at the stake just yet. Wait until Synod before we do that. The bad news is I'm back in time for Synod this year. So bring the tar and feathers. Okay, so one of the points McKnight makes straight up is that the Gospels should have, he suggests, with a kind of a question mark, an analogous role within Christianity to the role that Torah plays, because they're about Jesus, and Jesus is at the centre of Christianity. Okay, and they're in a sense foundational text. I think that's my term, not his, but I think he would agree with that. That just as Torah is foundational for Judaism, so the Gospels, and particularly the Synoptic Gospels, are foundational for Christianity. Okay? However, and this is a point that I don't think he makes sufficiently, the community of practice, and therefore the context of using these foundational texts, is very different. Okay? The way that Torah functions in contemporary Judaism is nothing like the way the Gospels function in contemporary Christianity. Okay? Indeed, the way the Bible functions in Judaism is very different from the way the Bible functions in Christianity. Observant Jews will actually study the Talmud rather than the Bible. Okay, so the Bible comes packaged in an interpretive context that includes Mishnah and Talmud. And for Christians, there's a more direct engagement with the text, even though we all operate within communities of interpretation that say, no, you can't look at it that way, you've got to look at it this way. But it's not quite as documented as the Talmud. So Christianity differs from Judaism at so many points, and yet I'd certainly agree with Scott McKnight that there's an emphasis on what Jesus did and said, which is essential to Christianity and largely missing from Christianity. And he makes the point I've heard other people make many ways, which is to notice the gap in the creed between the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion. Like, nothing Jesus said or did is worth mentioning in the creed. Okay? Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Whoops, what did we miss? Well, the entire life and ministry of Jesus, that's what we missed. Because we're focused on the incarnation and the atonement. And we've missed Jesus in the process. Okay, so again, this is my phrase, not Scott McKnight's, but we need to reclaim Jesus for Christianity. Okay? And probably reclaim Christianity for Jesus, I suppose, as well. Okay? So recognise and take seriously the Jesus factor. And of course the Synoptic Gospels are centre stage for that kind of project. So part of this is actually, way I've expressed it there, escaping the Christological straitjacket of Christendom. But and McKnight talks about it in other ways, but it's like we're doing this Christian thing over here, and Jesus is standing over on the corner saying, what about me? Do I get a say in the future of the church? Do I get a say in what it means to be Christian? And bear in mind, Jesus was not a Christian, okay? And God is not Anglican, okay? So how do we connect those dots? How do we bring that all together? Okay. So the focus they're thinking about, these are kind of issues we will take with us, I hope, over the weeks ahead. He then talks about the need to recover values and virtue, and he's reflecting and bemoaning the loss of public virtue, public morality, and so on. And part of my response to that is say, well, that's just how it is. The world has changed. But there's also, I think he and I would disagree as to what extent there are singular, univocal Christian values around a lot of contested issues. The famous joke is, so you want a biblical family model? Okay, shall we go for polygamy? Shall we have 600 concubines? Do we marry our sister? I mean, family values change over time. And so a simple appeal to getting back to biblical values or biblical models of the family is, of course, an appeal to go back to the 19th century. It's not an appeal to go back to the 1st century or the 10th century BC. So nuancing this, I think, is also part of it. Not only are Christian values no longer univocal, but they're also not the dominant discourse in our culture. So that doesn't mean we abandon them, but we don't go around bemoaning the fact that Australia or America doesn't reflect Christian values. It's not a Christian society. So we have to argue for good public values on other grounds that are good for public health, mental health, whatever, rather than say, God says, you've got to do it. I was driving up to Gatton the other day to visit my younger daughter and went past that ugly sign, for by grace are ye saved through faith. Read your Bible! Big exclamation mark. And I said to Eve, I'd love to have the money to waste on buying the space right next to it and putting up a verse from the Quran and waiting for them to complain about religious persecution. It's fine to shout at us from Christian values, but when do other religious perspectives get a billboard? Okay. And then on the way back, I saw a Baha'i sign as we came out of Gatton. I went, there is actually some discourse going on here. Just if the signs were next to each other, that would be so much fun. So part of it is just suck it up, princess, and get used to the new space we're in. Okay, we're not the only game in town. We don't control the agenda. So how do we do the Jesus thing in this kind of world? And that's where Scott McKnight is going as well. That's one of his big areas of interest. Okay, so yes, there's been a loss of shared values, but then the question for me is, what are we trying to do as Jesus people? Are we wanting to claim our place at the table, which I'm all in favour of, or are we wanting to claim the table and exclude other people? And I'm not in favour of that. Okay. So whichever we're trying to do, however, the Synoptics will be central to our project. If we want to have a conversation about Christian values, Christian morality, Christian virtue that are distinctively Christian, then we're going to have to look at the Synoptics to see what Jesus said about this stuff. Okay? What did Rabbi Jesus have to say about this matter or that matter? Okay? So, and of course, in all of this, how do we make the kingdom of God, the Basileia to Theou, central to our conversations? Then there's the ecumenical interfaith dynamic, which I was interested to see Scott McKnight mentioning, that the Synoptics can actually be a safe place to begin ecumenical and even interfaith conversations. They're less theologically loaded than, say, the Gospel of John. It's easy to have a conversation with Jewish people around the Synoptic Gospels than around John's Gospel. Not so easy when you get to that verse at the end of Matthew 27 about his blood be on us and our children, but or Matthew 23 where he's attacking the Pharisees. But generally speaking, the Synoptics are a more accessible place for us to have conversations with Muslims and Jews and other people in our culture who may not be religious, but they still have a fascination with Jesus. I think the church is on the nose, but Jesus has residual respect in the community. Interesting, with the Jesus Seminar projects, when they put out a couple of their major volumes, the 5 Gospels was a hot seller, and it's of course focusing on the sayings of Jesus. A couple of years later they brought out the Acts of Jesus, that's ACTS, hardly anything sold. People resonate with the wisdom of Jesus in a different way than they do with Jesus the miracle worker, because we don't buy miracle workers in the West. But a wisdom teacher, that resonates. So what did Jesus say? People interested. What did Jesus do? Oh, come on, that's just legend. Okay? Coming out of the same sources, but there's a different resonance with the sayings of Jesus and with the Synoptic Jesus versus the Johannine Jesus. Of course, even the Synoptics are deeply theological texts. Okay? Mark's Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, who's come to die on the cross and so on. So the Synoptics are not innocent, but what we're being alerted to here is there's a whole lot more to Jesus, a whole lot more to the Christ figure than what we find in the Gospels and especially what we find in the creeds. So one of the questions we might find ourselves asking is, how does Jesus function in other contexts? And I've actually tried to play with that a bit in one of the final chapter of the new book. You know, what if we just let Jesus loose to go and do the Jesus thing in Islam instead of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity? What might the ministry of Jesus be as an Islamic prophet within Islam? Why do we have to keep control of the theological property of Jesus? Because he's ours. Why don't we just let him go and let the Muslim people engage with Jesus in their own terms, as they do? Okay? And similarly for Jewish people. Now that they're coming out of the shadow of having Jesus' friends pushing them around for 2,000 years and persecuting them and driving them out and putting them in gas ovens and so on. So it's pretty hard for a Jewish person to even want to hear the word Jesus, because Jesus hangs out in some pretty bad company called Christianity. Okay? But as they get more space and as they find their own feet and so on, to what extent can Jewish people reclaim their most famous Jewish teacher? Okay? Not as the Son of God, but as Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, the Jewish prophet. And how do we let that happen? How do we stand back and say, we want Jesus to be a blessing to you as Jews, we don't want to try and make you into Christians. So interfaith and ecumenical conversations, as well as conversations between different kinds of Christians. That's why you might want to have the tar and feathers ready for synod. Okay, so McKnight goes in briefly then to look at what he calls the three windows, which is just his remake of Sandra Schneider's Three Worlds. Okay, he talks about looking through the window to see the world outside, the world behind the text. Okay, he talks about looking at the window and noticing the panes and the frame and how it's arranged, the world of the text. And he talks about looking at one's reflection in the window, which is looking at the world in front of the text, okay, our context. It's just chosen a slightly different metaphor to play with the same idea. So looking through the window, and this is partly a review of his article, I guess. In his discussion, he omits most of what we might notice through the window, because he's pretty fixated on the historical Jesus stuff. And he's not happy with how the historical Jesus debate has gone. That's okay. But there's a lot more out the window than the historical Jesus. There's first century Galilee, and there's all kinds of information which we could look at through the window and see on the outside. And that's a topic we'll come back, particularly the historical Jesus question. It's a topic we'll come back to in a couple of weeks. And it's your great joy or it's your great frustration to have a historical Jesus person as the lecturer for this course.
Stops us getting bored.
Stops you getting bored. Gives you something else to disagree with. So on the way through, he has a little dig at the Jesus seminar, totally misrepresents them and sets up a straw man, but we'll talk about that another time. He fails to pick up at all what we're learning about Palestinian Jewish life in the time of Jesus, although he comes back to it in a much, much later in the course of his chapter. And expresses some excitement at the discovery that Jesus was Jewish, which is about as exciting as discovering the Pope is Catholic. Okay. And it's hardly a new discovery, but it's become a tribal badge. And it's part of a twisting of the conversation. There are no historical Jesus scholars in the last 50 years that have ever questioned the Jewishness of Jesus. It's become one of those, have you stopped beating your wife yet kind of questions. Answer yes or no and you're in trouble either way. Okay? So yes, Jesus was Jewish. Yep, and the Pope is Catholic. So let's move on and say, well, what kind of Catholic? What kind of Jew? What kind of Jesus? What kind of Christian am I? That's the more interesting stuff. Then staring out the window, and he skims over a number of issues, and this is probably a section to read more closely in preparation next couple of weeks. Talks about the synoptic problem very briefly, a brief overview of Q, talks about the four source hypothesis, which he likes to call the Oxford hypothesis. Guess where he did his PhD. He talks about mark and priority. These are all fundamental issues of synoptic gospel scholarship. Although virtually all of them are how we got the Gospels. These are actually issues for looking through. These are not interpreting the text as we have it. These are asking how we got the text which we're now reading. Okay? Isn't it mean to critique someone else's work? But at least you can see what I do to your essays now. Okay, so finally he talks about redaction criticism, but even when he talks about redaction criticism, and he talks about unmasking the evangelist, unmasking the communities which gave us the Gospels, he still jumped through the window and he's playing outside in the world behind the text. Okay? It's hard for Western scholars not to go out and play in the world behind the text. The historical orientation of the Western intellectual project since the Enlightenment is incredibly powerful. Okay? It's hard for us to stay with the text even when we say that's what we're doing. Okay? Really, really tough. And Scott finds it tricky as well. Then he talks about the shift that's gone on from the text to the reader, and particularly talks about Kingsbury, really important Matthew scholar. And then he picks up, and I thought, a really interesting conversation around the process developed by Ulrich Lutz to talk about the dialogical engagement between reader, events, text, and so on. And he has his Wirkungsgeschichte, the history of effects. So looking at how this has worked out, basically, is what's going on here. New Testament scholars like to use German labels to impress our students. Okay. So the basic point is that real people create texts, and texts are secondary and derivative. I thought, so you're saying that the ancient community trumps the Bible, or what's going on here? Because it's more sophisticated than that. But real people create texts. The texts are secondary to something that actually happened back in the 1st century, 5th century, BCE, whatever. Something happened. Communities formed around those experiences. Those communities generated these texts. However, once the texts are generated, they have their own effect on subsequent generations of readers. And so it becomes this dynamic, dialogical kind of process. Real events, real people, real actual communities generate the text, but then time moves on and the texts shape, impact upon, form other people. And the texts generate multiple readings, multiple meanings in other places and in other times. The text doesn't have just one meaning. The text will have a variety of meanings depending on the context, time and place, who the readers are, what they're dealing with in their lives and so on. I thought, I like this guy. That's how I think as well, so he must be right. It's always good to find someone whose prejudice is the same as your own, because then you know you've discovered deep truth. Okay. The thing that I liked even better about this, he said, so how do we know that a meaning which is generated by a text is true? Well, the test is, does it correspond with Jesus? Okay. Does it correspond with Jesus? Now, then you've got the question, which Jesus? The Jesus Seminar Jesus, the Luke Johnson Jesus, the Ray Brown Jesus, the Scott McKnight Jesus. But we're all, everybody, despite our factional fighting, we're all agreeing that the real test here is this way of reading the Bible, this way of reading life, this way of being disciples, does it resonate? Is it consistent with the Jesus legacy? Now, we will have slightly different takes on the Jesus legacy, but is the way we're doing church consistent with Jesus? Scott McKnight asked that question, I would ask that same question. Okay? So, the correspondence with the Jesus tradition, and even if it is corresponding in some deep and authentic way with the Jesus tradition, the real test is it generating love? Okay? Is it having the consequence of what he calls bearing the fruit of love? Or I would say compassion. Are we creating, forming, sustaining compassionate communities of practice? Okay? Which is my definition of an authentic church. Okay, I think we can take our break at that stage. The next section in the notes is just, we'll just do it, take another 5 minutes, is him looking at, what he outlines as 5 different strategies for reading the Gospels. And I don't think this was the best part of his chapter, but I guess it was a way of wrapping it up and pulling it all together at the end. He talks about approaching the text historically, and this is where he throws in some of the material he perhaps could have mentioned earlier. What are we learning about Galilee in the first century? What do we now know about Pharisees, Sadducees, about Rome's presence? What are we learning from the coins? That's obviously really important for someone like me. So, how do we attend to and make use of this growing bunch of information? And in terms of the new book, which is hopefully arriving sometime this week, that's what the first section in the book is doing. Looking at that kind of historical information. We can also look at themes. We can pick up a theme like the kingdom of heaven, or life after death, or justice or poverty, or whatever. We can pick up a theme and see how is that dealt with through the Synoptic tradition, and indeed through the Gospel tradition. And another little act of self-promotion, that's exactly what the middle part. So this guy's onto something, obviously. The middle part of the new book is doing exactly that, picking up 4 themes and not just following Matthew, Mark or Luke, but looking at, with a methodology, how do we draw stuff together to try and interrogate the tradition, the Jesus tradition, which is not bound by the literary boundaries but looks at the inherited tradition. We can look at each gospel individually, and that's of course what, say, redaction criticism typically does. But it's also a theological reading of Mark, a theological reading of Matthew, and so on. What does this gospel have to say about Jesus, about this question, about discipleship, whatever? He talks about then looking at the gospels together comparatively, and my take on that is that's a version of, say, canonical criticism, which is to say, well, canonically we have 4 gospels. Yes, we might pick up little bits and pieces from the other Gospels, but within the canon, we have the Gospel, the 4 Gospels, we have Paul, we have the other epistles and so on. So as we read a passage, as we read this tradition, we're reading it in its canonical form, and we're looking for the interactions. What does Mark add to the picture of Jesus from the Gospels? What does John add to the Gospel? What does Matthew bring, which would be missing if we didn't have that? So reading them as a set, reading Matthew with an eye on Luke and John, rather than simply reading Matthew, thinking that's our focus, okay? And that's something we will be doing as the semester unfolds. And then he makes the point that we read the Bible, read the Gospels corporatively. My rehash of that is that Bible reading is not a solo adventure. Okay, it's best done in the company of other pilgrims. Now, some of them are people, as he describes quite neatly at the end of his essay, some of them are people that are no longer alive, but we can access their wisdom by reading their commentaries, by reading their books, by reading their prayers or whatever. So we can have a Franciscan approach, or we can consult Luther or Calvin or whoever. Some of them are contemporary scholars we can engage with, some of them are our peers in the classroom, some of them are our family or the people in our home group, people we worship with. So we'll have various circles of people with varying degrees of intimacy, and they're part of us engaging with Scripture. They're part of us engaging with the Gospels. Okay. So again, this I think it's I don't think this was the strongest, most significant part of his chapter, but it's a reminder as we think about what are we doing here, there is much more to reading the text than engaging with it historically, even much more than engaging with it in terms of I guess, literary criticism. This is about reading for wisdom, it's about reading for insight, it's about shaping disciples, and that's going to be best done in the company of other people that are engaged in the same project. Okay, so let's leave it there.